Mocking laughter echoed from the paddock, but Mason Reed just sat silent in the cabin of his rusted Mustang 67, hands trembling on the steering wheel. Outside, young drivers with their modern supercars were pointing at number 27 like it was some kind of joke at Road Atlanta. But Mason's eyes weren't looking at them. He was staring fixedly at Turn 10A in the distance, where 20 years ago the sound of twisted metal still echoed through every dream. His hand gently touched the number 27 decal, the number his father, Roy Razor Reed, once carried to the pinnacle of glory, then down to the depths of fear. "Dad," 15-year-old Ava's voice came through the radio, soft but carrying a strength Mason had long forgotten. But would it be enough for a single father mechanic, someone who had once been called a failure by his own ex-wife, to prove that sometimes junkyard cars can run faster than perfect machines? It truly seemed impossible. The morning Georgia sun cast long shadows across Road Atlanta's paddock, where the scent of race fuel and tire rubber mixed with the crisp October air. Mason Reed stood beside his 1967 Mustang, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag that had seen better decades. The car looked like it had crawled out of a salvage yard, which, in many ways, it had. Primer grey patches covered most of the body where rust had been cut away, and the faded blue paint that remained told stories of countless track days and even more sleepless nights in Mason's cramped garage. "Nice scrapyard special, Grandpa." Logan Pike's voice cut through the morning chatter as he strutted past with his pristine Shelby GT 350. The 20-something YouTuber's laugh carried that particular brand of cruelty that only came from someone who'd never had to choose between paying rent and buying brake pads. His followers loved his cocky attitude almost as much as his daddy's money loved funding his racing hobby. Trent Dalton joined in from beside his spotless Camaro, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Try not to oil down Turn 7, old man. Some of us actually want to finish this race." The younger drivers clustered around their modern machines like a pack of wolves, their carbon fiber wings and data acquisition systems gleaming under the morning light. To them, Mason's Mustang wasn't just old. It was an insult to everything they believed racing should be. Mason said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he continued checking tire pressures. He'd learned long ago that words were cheap on race day. It was lap times that did the talking. Still, their laughter stung more than he cared to admit, especially when it echoed the same dismissive tone his ex-wife Sarah had used 3 years ago when she'd packed her bags and walked out of their lives. "Dad, they're just scared," Ava said quietly, appearing at his elbow with a torque wrench and a confidence that belied her 15 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her coveralls bore the same oil stains that had become Mason's permanent cologne. She'd been his crew chief since she was 12, not because he couldn't afford to hire help, but because she understood the car and him better than anyone else alive. "Scared of what, kiddo?" Mason asked, though he kept his voice low enough that the other drivers couldn't hear. The last thing he needed was for them to know that his 15-year-old daughter was essentially running his entire operation, of finding out that all their fancy gadgets can't replace what you've got. She replied, tapping her temple with a grease-stained finger. Mom never understood that, did she? The question hit harder than any insult Logan or Trent could throw. Sarah had married a rising star, a young driver, who'd been scouted by NASCAR teams and had sponsors knocking down his door. But when Roy Reed's fatal crash at this very track had shattered more than just metal and dreams, She'd found herself married to a broken man who spent his days fixing other people's cars instead of racing his own. The garage had been Mason's sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could honor his father's memory by keeping other people's dreams alive while his own collected dust. "Your father was the best wheelman I ever saw," Sarah had said during their last real conversation, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "But that man died with Roy." "I can't raise Ava with a ghost, Mason. I won't watch her grow up thinking that settling for less is noble." The divorce papers had been signed within a month, and Sarah had moved to Atlanta with her new fiancé, a real estate developer who thought horsepower was something you ordered at restaurants. Now, standing in the same paddock where his father had once been king, Mason wondered if Sarah had been right. Maybe he was just a ghost haunting someone else's life, too afraid to live his own. The other drivers certainly seemed to think so, judging by their continued commentary about his rolling scrap heap and questions about whether his car had passed safety inspection. 20 minutes to driver's meeting." The track announcer's voice crackled over the PA system, jolting Mason back to the present. Around him, the modern teams went through their high-tech pre-race rituals, downloading telemetry data, adjusting suspension settings on computer screens, and discussing tire strategies that sounded more like military operations than hobby racing. Mason's preparation was decidedly more analog. He walked around the Mustang one more time, checking for loose bolts by hand and trusting his eyes to spot anything that didn't look right. This car might not have carbon fiber or data loggers, but every piece of it had been touched by his hands. Every bolt had been tightened by his wrench. He knew exactly how the suspension would behave when the track got hot, precisely how the engine would respond when he needed that extra surge of power down the back straight. The car itself was a testament to patient craftsmanship and careful engineering. Under the battered hood sat a small block Ford that Mason had built from the ground up, each component chosen for reliability rather than peak power. The suspension used modern shocks and a larger front anti-roll bar to keep the car stable through Road Atlanta's challenging S's, while the rear axle had been fitted with traction bars and limited slip differential to put power down effectively when exiting corners. Most importantly, the braking system had been completely modernized. Four-wheel disc brakes with performance pads and high-temperature brake fluid, cooled by carefully ducted airflow, meant Mason could brake later and harder than anyone expected from a 50-year-old car. The brake bias adjuster mounted within easy reach let him fine-tune the balance as the tires wore, and the track conditions changed throughout the race. "Remember what we talked about?" Ova said, handing him his helmet, a simple white design with the number 27 prominently displayed. "The car's ready." "You're ready? The only thing left is to drive it like you built it." Mason nodded, but his eyes drifted involuntarily toward Turn 10A, the fast right-hander that led onto the back straight. It was there, exactly 20 years ago, that Roy Razor Reed had lost control during a late race charge for the lead. The subsequent investigation had blamed brake failure, but Mason knew the truth was more complicated. His father had been pushing too hard, trying to make up for a poor qualifying position, refusing to accept anything less than victory. The crash had been spectacular, the kind that made highlight reels and left families shattered. He was trying to prove something, Mason murmured, more to himself than to Ava. Always trying to prove he belonged with the big boys. "And what are you trying to prove?" Ava asked gently. It was a question that Mason couldn't answer, at least not honestly. Was he trying to prove that blue-collar craftsmanship could still compete with unlimited budgets? That a father and daughter team could take on professional racing operations? Or was he simply trying to prove to himself that he wasn't the failure Sarah had made him feel like? The qualifying session that morning had been a disaster. The engine had run rich, stumbling through the higher RPM ranges where Mason needed it most. He'd managed only 11th out of 16 cars, while Logan Pike had taken pole position in his Shelby, followed closely by the current club champion, Vic Alvarez, in his pristine number 88 Corvette. The qualifying times had given the other drivers even more ammunition for their jokes about participation trophies and rolling chicanes. But qualifying was just one lap. The race was 18 laps of Road Atlanta's demanding 2.5-mile circuit, 18 chances to prove that sometimes the tortoise really could catch the hare. Mason had studied every inch of this track, knew every bump and every groove in the asphalt. He'd spent countless hours here as a child, watching his father work magic with machinery that was already old-fashioned 20 years ago. "Drivers to the meeting room." The announcement echoed across the paddock, and Mason watched as the other competitors began making their way toward the track offices. Logan Pike strutted like he owned the place, high-fiving his crew and posing for selfies with fans who'd recognized him from his YouTube channel. Trent Dalton walked with the confident swagger of someone who'd never finished worse than 4th in 3 years of club racing. Mason followed at a distance, Ava walking beside him with her radio headset draped around her neck. They made an unusual pair, the quiet mechanic and his teenage crew chief, but they'd learned to operate as a team out of necessity. When you couldn't afford a full crew, every person had to do the work of 3. The drivers' meeting was routine: safety procedures, flag protocols, and reminders about track limits. Mason half-listened while studying his competitors. Most of them were weekend warriors with 6-figure cars and 7-figure day jobs. They raced because they could afford to, not because they had to. The distinction mattered more than most people realized. "Grid positions are posted," the race director announced. "Green flag in 30 minutes. As the meeting broke up, Mason overheard Logan Pike talking to his crew chief about tire strategy and fuel conservation. The conversation was peppered with technical terms that sounded impressive, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how older cars actually behaved on track. These drivers had learned to race by downloading data and analyzing telemetry graphs. They'd never learned to feel what the car was telling them through the steering wheel and seat of their pants. Walking back to the car, Mason felt the familiar pre-race butterflies starting to build in his stomach. It was the same feeling he'd had 20 years ago when he was supposed to be Roy Reed's heir apparent, the same mixture of excitement and terror that came with strapping yourself into a machine designed to go faster than human beings were ever meant to travel. "You know what the secret is?" Ava said as they reached the Mustang, where she began her final pre-race checks of tire pressures and belt tightness. "What's that?" "They think racing is about the car," she said, patting the Mustang's faded hood. "But you know it's about the driver." Mum never understood that either. The comment stung because it was true. Sarah had fallen in love with the promise of what Mason might become, not who he actually was. When that promise had died with Roy Reed, she'd lost interest in the man who remained. She'd wanted a champion, not a craftsman, a winner, not a survivor. 5 minutes to grid. The announcement came, and Mason felt his pulse quicken. Around him, the other teams made final adjustments and wished each other luck with the kind of casual confidence that came from having nothing real at stake. For them, this was a hobby. For Mason, it felt like something much more important, a chance to prove that some things couldn't be bought, only earned. As he climbed into the Mustang's driver's seat, Mason's hands automatically found their familiar positions on the steering wheel. The interior was sparse compared to the high-tech cockpits surrounding him. Just gauges, switches, and the brake bias adjuster that might prove crucial later in the race. But everything was exactly where it needed to be, positioned through hundreds of hours of testing and adjustment. Radio check. Ava's voice came through his headset, calm and professional despite her age. Copy, crew chief, Mason replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice at the formal title. They'd been practicing radio procedures for months, turning their father-daughter relationship into something that resembled a real racing operation. The pace car began its slow lap around the circuit, and 16 race cars fell into formation behind it. Mason found himself in the 6th row, surrounded by machines that had cost more than his house. But as they rolled through the first sector, past the spot where his father had taken his final checkered flag, Mason felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about proving anything to Logan Pike or Trent Dalton or even Sarah. This was about the promise he'd made to a 15-year-old girl who believed that her father was capable of miracles. The pace car pulled off, and Mason could see the green flag waving in the distance. In a few seconds, 18 laps of Road Atlanta would separate him from whatever came next. As the field accelerated toward Turn 1, Mason Reed closed his eyes for just a moment and whispered a prayer that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with coming home alive. The green flag dropped, and 30 years of preparation compressed into a single moment of truth. The start was chaos, as it always was at Road Atlanta. The field compressed like an accordion as drivers jockeyed for position through the fast-sweeping Turn 1, with Logan Pike leading the charge in his Shelby and Vic Alvarez tucked in close behind. Mason held his line on the inside, letting the more aggressive drivers sort themselves out while he focused on keeping his tires underneath him. But something went wrong immediately. As Mason fed power to the Mustang's rear wheels, they broke loose more than expected, sending the car sliding sideways as the field streamed past. He caught it quickly, his hands working the steering wheel with practiced precision. But the damage was done. By the time they reached Turn 2, he'd dropped from 11th to 13th place, with only 3 cars behind him. "Easy, Dad." Ava's voice came through the radio, steady and reassuring. "We've got 17 laps to work with." "Stay patient and let them come to you." Mason forced himself to breathe as he settled into a rhythm behind a struggling Porsche 911. The car felt good underneath him. The suspension was working exactly as he'd hoped, keeping the Mustang stable through Road Atlanta's demanding sequence of corners. The brakes felt strong and responsive, with plenty of cooling airflow keeping temperatures under control. By lap 3, Mason had found his groove. The Mustang might not have been the fastest car on the track, but it was predictable and trustworthy in ways that the high-strung modern machines weren't. When Logan Pike's Shelby began showing signs of brake fade entering Turn 10A, Mason took notes. When Trent Dalton's Camaro started pushing wide through the S's, overworked from trying to keep pace with faster cars, Mason filed that information away for later use. The key was patience. The same virtue that had taught him to rebuild engines and restore classic cars was serving him well on track. While other drivers burned through their tires and brakes trying to make dramatic early race passes, Mason conserved his equipment and waited for opportunities to present themselves. Those opportunities came sooner than expected. On lap 4, The yellow flag flew when two cars tangled in turn 6, bringing out the safety car and bunching up the field. Mason had been running a steady 13th, learning the behavior of the cars around him and noting which drivers were struggling with specific corners. The caution period gave him a chance to reset and plan his strategy for the restart. "How are the tires feeling?" Ivar asked through the radio. "Good. Real good," Mason replied, testing the brake pedal pressure and finding it firm and consistent. "The cooling ducts are working perfectly. Temps are staying nice and stable." When the safety car pulled off on lap 6, Mason was ready. He'd positioned himself on the inside line, and when the field accelerated toward turn 6, he made his move. The Mustang's improved traction control and limited slip differential gave him a better launch than the car immediately ahead, and he was able to slip past 2 positions before they reached turn 7. "Nice work!" Ivar's voice carried a note of excitement. "You're up to P11, and the leader is starting to come back to the field." Indeed, Logan Pike's early pace was beginning to tell on his equipment. The Shelby was still fast, but it was no longer pulling away from the rest of the field. Vic Alvarez in the Corvette had closed the gap and was clearly waiting for an opportunity to take the lead. Mason, meanwhile, was hitting his stride. The Mustang felt alive beneath him, responding to his inputs with the kind of precision that only came from countless hours of setup work and testing. When he caught up to the back of a battle between 2 Camaros, he was able to use the Mustang's superior exit speed from turn 7 to draft past both cars on the back straight. "P9 now," Ava reported, her voice starting to carry real excitement. "And Dad, your sector times are getting faster. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." What Mason was doing was driving like his father had taught him, smoothly, efficiently, always thinking 2 corners ahead. Roy Reed had been famous for his late race charges, his ability to make a car go faster when it mattered most. Mason had always assumed that was pure talent, but now he was beginning to understand that it was actually strategy disguised as instinct. By lap 8, Mason had worked his way up to 7th place, helped by a mechanical failure that sidelined one of the faster Corvettes. He was now running in clean air for the first time all day, and the Mustang was responding beautifully. The engine was pulling strong all the way to red line, the brakes were staying cool and consistent, and the suspension was soaking up Road Atlanta's bumps without unsettling the car. More importantly, Mason was starting to catch the cars ahead of him. Trent Dalton's Camaro was beginning to show signs of tire wear, and Logan Pike's Shelby was definitely struggling with brake fade. The gap to the leaders was still substantial, but it was no longer growing. "Dad," Irva's voice came through the radio, more serious now. "I think we need to talk about strategy. The leaders are going to start thinking about pit stops soon, and we have a choice to make." Mason knew exactly what she meant. They could follow the leaders into the pits, taking fresh tires and fuel but losing track position. Or they could stay out, gambling that their tire conservation and fuel management had been good enough to run the full distance. It was the kind of strategic decision that could make or break a race. "What does your gut tell you?" Mason asked, using a brief straight section to glance at his fuel gauge and tire temperature readings. "I think we stay out," Ivar replied, without hesitation. "Your lap times are still consistent, the tire temperatures look good, and fuel consumption is right where we calculated. Plus, every car that pits is going to have to work their way back through traffic. It was a bold strategy, the kind that Roy Reed might have chosen in his prime, but it was also risky. If their calculations were wrong, they'd find themselves running out of fuel or struggling on worn tires while the leaders charged back through the field on fresh rubber. "Copy that, crew chief," Mason said, settling the argument. "We're staying out. The decision proved to be inspired. As the leaders began pitting on lap 10, Mason suddenly found himself inheriting positions he'd never expected to see. By the time the pit cycle was complete, he was running in 4th place, behind only 3 cars that had also chosen to stay out. One of those was Vic Alvarez in the Corvette, who was clearly saving his tires for a late race charge. "Holy shit, Dad!" Iva's voice crackled through the radio before she caught herself. "Sorry, you're in 4th place. 4th. Mason allowed himself a small smile as he navigated through the S's, but he knew the hard work was just beginning. The cars that had pitted were now charging back through the field on fresh tires, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up to the leaders. Mason's task was to stay ahead of them for as long as possible, while not making any mistakes that would cost him the positions he'd gained. For 3 laps, the strategy worked perfectly. Mason maintained 4th place while the pit stop leaders clawed their way back through traffic. Logan Pike was making particularly aggressive moves, sometimes forcing other drivers to yield position rather than risk contact with the YouTuber's expensive Shelby. But on lap 14, reality began to catch up. Trent Dalton's Camaro, now on fresh tires, appeared in Mason's mirrors and was closing fast. The gap that had taken Mason 10 laps to build was disappearing in a matter of corners. "He's coming," Iva warned. "But Dad, you're still running consistent times." "The car's not falling off like we thought it might." Mason could feel the Camaro's presence behind him, could see Trent looking for an opportunity to make a pass. But Mason also knew something that Trent didn't turn 10A was coming up, the same corner where Roy Reed had pushed too hard and paid the ultimate price. It was also the corner where Mason had always been most cautious, most afraid to take the risks that racing sometimes demanded. As they approached the braking zone, Mason made a split-second decision that surprised even himself. Instead of his usual conservative approach, he stayed on the gas a fraction longer, braked later and harder than he'd ever dared, and turned into the corner with more commitment than fear. The Mustang held its line perfectly, the modern braking system and tire setup working exactly as designed. Trent, caught off guard by Mason's suddenly aggressive approach, had to brake earlier to avoid contact. By the time they reached the back straight, Mason had actually extended his lead slightly. "Where did that come from?" Ava's voice was filled with amazement. "I think," Mason said, his heart pounding from the adrenaline, "I just remembered what it feels like to race." The final 4 laps were a blur of intensity and focus. Logan Pike had worked his way back to 2nd place and was closing on the leader, while Vic Alvarez was running a patient 3rd, waiting for someone ahead of him to make a mistake. Mason found himself in a battle for 4th, with Trent Dalton and another Corvette, both on fresher tires, but neither able to find a way past the surprisingly quick Mustang. On lap 16, disaster struck for one of the leaders. The car running 2nd suffered a mechanical failure going into turn 1, pulling off to the side with what appeared to be engine problems. Suddenly, Mason found himself inheriting 3rd place with 2 laps to go. "Dad, I can't believe this!" Iva's voice was almost breathless. "You're in 3rd place. 2 laps to go and you're on the podium." But Mason knew that Logan Pike, now running 2nd, was going to be coming for him. The Shelby had been fast all day, and Pike was exactly the kind of driver who wouldn't hesitate to take risks for a podium position. Mason could see him in his mirrors, closing the gap with each corner. The penultimate lap was a masterclass in defensive driving. Mason didn't try to match Pike's pace. Instead, he focused on not making mistakes, on hitting his marks and making his car as wide as possible in the corners where passing was most likely. When Pike got a good run coming out of turn 7, Mason was ready, covering the inside line and forcing the Shelby to settle for following rather than leading. "Last lap, Dad?" Ava's voice was tight with tension. "One more lap and you've got a podium finish." Mason's hands were completely steady on the steering wheel now, all his pre-race nerves replaced by the kind of focused calm that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. The Mustang felt like an extension of his own body, responding to his inputs with precision and grace. Pike made his final move coming out of the last corner, getting a better launch and pulling alongside the Mustang as they accelerated toward the finish line. For a moment, the two cars were side by side, neither giving an inch. But Mason had one last trick up his sleeve, a slight draft advantage, and the knowledge that his car had been built for reliability rather than peak power. The Mustang held its advantage by inches, crossing the finish line in third place, while Logan Pike had to settle for fourth. As Mason took the checkered flag, he could hear Ava screaming with joy through the radio, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what they'd accomplished together. "We did it, Dad! We got a podium! I can't believe we actually did it!" Mason couldn't believe it either. As he took his cool-down lap, waving to the corner workers who'd watched his father race on this same track decades earlier, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Not the relief of paying bills or the satisfaction of fixing someone else's car, but the simple happiness that came from proving that dreams didn't always die with the people who dreamed them. In the pits, the other teams were already packing up their equipment, but there was a different energy now. The mockery and dismissive comments from the morning had been replaced by grudging respect and genuine congratulations. Even Trent Dalton, who'd finished fifth after being passed by yet another car in the closing laps, came over to shake Mason's hand. "Hell of a drive," Trent said, and Mason could tell he meant it. "That thing was glued to the track out there. What's your secret?" Mason looked at Ava, who was beaming with pride as she helped him climb out of the car, and then at the Mustang, which was battered and bruised, but still running strong after 18 hard laps. "No secret," he said finally. "Just a lot of time in the garage and a really good crew chief." The podium ceremony was surreal. Mason found himself standing on the third step, flanked by Vic Alvarez, who'd won the race, and another Corvette driver who'd inherited second place after Logan Pike had been penalized for an aggressive move that had forced another car off track. As they played the national anthem and handed out the trophies, Mason caught sight of Ava in the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she held up her phone to record the moment. Later, as they loaded the Mustang onto its trailer for the long drive home, Mason noticed that several of the other teams had stopped by to look at the car more closely. They were examining the suspension setup, the brake cooling ducts, and the careful weight distribution that had made the old car competitive with machines costing 10 times as much. "You know what this means, don't you?" Ava said as she secured the last tie-down strap. "What's that?" "Mom was wrong," she said simply. "About everything." Mason thought about Sarah, probably watching their suburban house while her new husband worked late at his real estate office. He wondered if she'd heard about the race, if she'd seen the photos that were already starting to appear on social media. Part of him hoped she had, hoped she'd understand what she'd given up when she'd decided that settling for less was the same thing as settling for enough. But mostly, he just felt grateful. Grateful for a daughter who'd never stopped believing in him. Grateful for a car that had carried 3 generations of Reed family dreams, and grateful for a sport that still rewarded craftsmanship and determination over wealth and technology. As they drove away from Road Atlanta, Mason glanced in his mirrors one last time at the track where his father had lived and died, where his own racing dreams had been buried and then unexpectedly resurrected. Tomorrow he'd be back in his garage, fixing other people's cars and dreaming of the next race weekend. But tonight he was going home with a trophy and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, the underdog really does win. "So," Ava said as they merged onto the interstate, "when's our next race?" Mason laughed, the sound carrying 20 years of suppressed joy and newfound hope. "Whenever you want, crew chief." Whenever you want. The trophy sat on the dashboard between them, catching the late afternoon sunlight as they drove toward home, toward whatever came next, toward a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities again. Behind them, the number 27 Mustang rested peacefully on its trailer, its job done for another day, but its story far from over. Mason Reed had come to Road Atlanta to prove something to his critics, to his ex-wife, to himself. But what he'd discovered instead was something far more valuable. That some victories can't be measured in lap times or trophies, and that the most important races are often the ones we run against our own fears and limitations. The mockery had turned to respect. The salvaged Mustang had proven its worth, and a single father mechanic had shocked everyone on the track. But more than anything, Mason had learned that it's never too late to chase a dream, especially when you have someone who believes in you riding shotgun.